Hey guys, what is up? This is Mike Rosada, and this video is a companion video to a course that I'm putting out in a couple months called JavaScript in 7 days. It's a quick course, it moves fast, and because of that, we can't dive super deep into a lot of topics. And for students that have questions or people that are just interested in stuff like this anyway, these companion videos will dive a bit deeper. And the first thing I wanted to dive into was the differences between var, let, and const. They all do something very similar. In the videos, well, on day one at least, of the course coming out, I only introduce var. And certain people might wonder, well, why only var? Why not let and const? And the reason is because var is so much simpler. It's a lot more forgiving for new people coming in and learning this stuff. I don't use it at all. Experienced developers probably don't use it at all. And it's not because it's so bad. It's just that you can do all the same things with let and const. And if you're using best practices, they are better. This video is going to go kind of deep into some of the reasons why I didn't use var, and by the end you should understand the differences between all three of these, and you should be able to choose which situations you think are best to use which ones. Alright, so let's just start it off very simple. We're going to console log a message. So we're going to create a variable and we'll call it test var. And we haven't declared it yet. And so here we're just logging out test var equals, and then we're going to log the variable. And if you've never seen strings like this, it's basically the same as just writing test var equals plus test var. Okay, this is just a template. It's the same thing as writing this. So on the next line, I'm going to do var test var equals hello world. And then I'm going to hit enter, and we see that up here logged test var equals undefined. And the reason is that test var is not defined, but it is declared. Alright, so and the difference here is that the variable is declared. It can be seen by our code up here, but it's not defined. It's not assigned a value. If I actually refresh the whole page, so it's like we're starting over, and we don't include this second line, and I just hit enter, we get a reference error. Test var is not defined. Okay, so our code can't see it. It's not in scope. And that's what scope means. If a variable is in scope, it means that we can see it. We can use it in our code. In this case, we can't. Let's get our previous example back up. When we ran it this way, our code could see it. And the reason it could see it is JavaScript doesn't interpret this code like, okay, so here's line 1 and here's line 2. The first thing the JavaScript engine does is it looks through all of our code, and when it sees us declaring a variable, right, this is declaring, this is an assignment operator, so this is defining, but when it sees us define or declare, so even if we didn't give this a value, if we didn't assign it, JavaScript takes out the declaration and it just moves it to the top of the scope. And so this code here that we wrote actually runs like this. Alright, so JavaScript takes this and it turns it into this. So the variable is defined. Because it is defined, but it doesn't have a value, when this code runs right after, it sees that test var is undefined, but it doesn't throw an error. And then on this following line, it gets assigned a value. And so if we did this on the fourth line. So if we log it out a second time, we'll just label this the first time. Oh, I'm going to refresh the page. So we're running this clean, hit enter. We see this is undefined. This is defined as hello world. So that should make sense. Now let's see what would happen if we do this example with let. And first we'll get rid of this definition up here. And so we're going to use let, which is going to create a variable, very similar to what var did. We are assigning it, so this is actually defining the variable test var, right? So this is declare, this is assign, put it together, it is define. So we're defining test var as hello world. Hit enter, and you see that we get an error. It says test var is not defined. Okay, let this sink in. I'm going to refresh the page, change this to var, hit enter. That works. Just going to refresh it again. When it's let, we get an error. However, if we had written it like this, so if we had declared test var up here using let, it's going to run exactly like this. Let's run it, and we see that when we declare test var and then we try to log it, our code sees that it is indeed declared. So it's declared, it's just not defined. It is undefined, so it logs out undefined. On this next line, we are assigning a value to test var. We're assigning the value hello world. So then on the next line, when we log out test var equals test var, it shows that it's equal to hello world. All right, so this is only one difference between let and var. They're very similar. They work almost the same way. With let, we cannot, just to illustrate it again, we cannot declare our variable down low and try to access it before it's declared. All right, so that variable isn't just given to all the code in this scope. Only code that's ran after we declare it and define it can see it, or just define. All we have to do is define it, and anything that's ran after that that's in the same scope will be able to see it. If the word scope is a little confusing and you're wondering what scope means, let's just look at that real quick. Let's refresh the page again. So we'll use var, test var. We're going to declare that here. We're going to write a function called test. Inside the function, we will set test var to 100, and then down here we'll call test. So up here we're going to console log, and we'll just log out test var equals test var. Same thing we've been doing. I'm going to copy this line. I'm going to run it again down here, and then we'll drop the same thing right here. Okay, so the reason we're doing this, we want to, if you want to get good with scope, and maybe right now you don't know what scope is, but you're going to find out in a second, you should try doing stuff like this, logging variables out in different places, but then put numbers in the order that you think these things are going to log out. Test is going to be called, so this will log second, and then after test, this line runs, so it'll be third. What do you think is going to happen when I hit enter? Okay, so we defined test var up here, so we know that's going to be undefined. Test gets called. This function runs, and it sets test var to 100, so it should change the value of test var. This should log out and be 100. But what do you think this variable is going to be when it's called the third time? it's 100. The reason because we assigned a value to test var inside the test function. So that should make sense. What if we create a test var here inside this function? We declare test var inside the test function. Now let's ask ourselves these same questions again. Which order do we think these are going to run in, and what do we think their values are going to be? I propose that the order is not going to change, right? This will be the first one. The function gets ran, so this will be the second one logged out, and then after we run the function, this will be the third. But what do we think is going to happen to the actual value assigned to test var? Here it should be undefined because this line runs, it's declared, but there's no value, so it's undefined. Nothing happens here yet. Test is called, so now the test function runs, and we set test var to 100, but we're also declaring a test var in the function. And so this should be 100, but what's this going to be? Try to lock in your answer in your head. Let's run it. And we see that the last one was undefined. This is undefined. Okay? So when we didn't declare that variable, the last one was 100. And when we did declare it inside test, that last test var is undefined. And the reason is because of scope. When we declare a variable inside a function, that variable can only be seen inside that function. That is its scope. And so you might remember that one of the first examples we sort of did, let me refresh this. One of the first examples that we did, we logged out a variable before we defined it. Okay, and we saw that it was hoisted to the top of the scope. So let's console log here the same thing. So this order will be 1, 2, 3. This will become 4. So we're accessing test var inside of our function before we declare it in the function also. So keep in mind, these are two different variables. They just have the same name, but they're in different scopes. We have this top level scope, this function level scope. So we hit enter, and we see that the first one is undefined. The second one is undefined, and this makes sense because we haven't given it a value. The fourth one is undefined because when we set 100 to test var here, it's the test var that exists inside this scope, inside the scope of the function. It cannot be seen outside of the function, and so this variable, even though it has the same name as this outside variable, they're two separate entities. Okay, and that's completely because of this keyword, this var keyword. And again, just like with the original example, the JavaScript engine is going to run through this whole function. It's going to see that we are declaring a variable down here, and so it's actually going to run this code like this. It's going to move the declaration up to the top of the scope, which happens to be here at the top of the function scope. So this will be undefined, but it's not undefined because of this. It's undefined because we haven't given a value to the variable in this scope. A good way to see this, what if we set test var to outer, a string outer. So this will be outer. When we call test, this test var should be undefined, even though we defined a value to the test var in the outside scope. So you see that? So the outside value is outer, the function is ran, we have a defined test var here, but it has no value. So when we log out test var in this second console log, it's undefined. By shadowing, we call this shadowing the name of this outer variable, our function can't see the outer variable. Normally, a function can see variables outside of itself, even though the outside world can't see into the function. But when we shadow the name of the outer variables, it blocks them. And so when we try to log out test var here, it just gets undefined. Third line, we assign it a value, and so here it's going to be 100. So then the function stops running, and on this last line we're logging out test var, and it's outer again, because outside of the function we can't see this inner scope. We only see this test var, this scope here. So that's what scope means. And for a long time in JavaScript, this was the only scope that concerned us. And then Let and Const came out, and so they work a bit differently. So let's take this same example and put this inside an if block. And we'll just say if true, run this. So this is always going to run. As far as var is concerned, this is all one scope. So inside this if block is the same as this outer scope. And we can see 1 is outer. When we log 2, that's outer as well. And that's because even though we are defining a variable here, it was already defined in this scope. Okay? So this can see the outer test var, and then we reassign it, and won't go through the rest of the story. Since we remove the test function, this throws an error. Now with let is going to behave inside of blocks. This is block level scope. Inside of brackets, it's going to behave the way that var behaved inside the function. So take 1 second, try to let that sink in. When we use the var declaration inside of a function, it created a variable that could only be seen inside of that function. When we define a variable with let, it creates a variable that can only be seen within this block scope. And we didn't have block scope in JavaScript for a very long time, so it was a very strange thing for a lot of people when we did get it. So for let and also for const, this is sort of like a function scope, okay? And it's any block level scope. So even if there is no if, this code here will still run. You know, we could actually do something like this. This is going to run. But let's just look at this first. We see that we should actually change our numbers. So we see that the first test var points to outer. That's not a surprise. The second test var is undefined because here we are creating a variable that is scoped to this block. And because we're doing that, we're shadowing this outer variable. And so we can't see it from here. And then we assign a value to test var, and we can see it. Let's create 2 let variables. So now what we're doing is sort of the same thing we were doing before, except now we're not shadowing. So we're creating a variable a with let outside here. We'll log it out. It should be outer. And then inside this block, we're declaring a variable b. It should only be visible in here. We're going to log out a, and then we're going to log out b We'll actually log out B here as well. And then out here, we'll log out A. And why don't we log out B as well? And I already told you that the variable B is only scoped to these braces, this block level scope. So I sort of already told you that we're not going to be able to see it out here in this fifth log. What do you think is going to happen when I run this code? This is outer. This is outer because even though let creates variables scoped to blocks, the biggest block that we could have out here would be this whole thing, right? So we can see A from anywhere, even inside here. B is undefined here because it is declared, but it's not defined. And then it's 100 here. A is still outer. B throws an error here. And the reason it throws an error is because it does not exist outside of this scope. So it's sort of the same thing as if we had a function, and in the function we create a variable x, and then outside of the function we try to console log x. Even if we run test, we're going to get an error that x is not defined because it's only scoped to this function. And so that's exactly what happens here. When we try to console log B, we get an error because it's only scoped to this block. And so one of the last things I sort of want to show you, and this is actually the reason that I don't introduce let right away to students. If we move this down here, so now what do you think is going to happen when we run this code? Normally with var, when we log B, it would just be undefined. When we run this with let, we see that we get a reference error. And so this is a very important concept when using let or const. You cannot access them in their scope before they are declared. This is what's referred to as a temporal dead zone. So if you thought of your code running on a timeline, you know, this runs, and then after that, this runs, and then this line, the time before a let variable is declared, you cannot access it. It doesn't exist, it's not declared or defined, and it's going to throw this reference error. This would even be true. So say if we put this let b equals 100 outside of this block scope, so it's part of this bigger scope. So now what do you think is going to happen? So we are able to see b that was declared outside of this block scope inside the block scope. But if we have another declaration for b, and so now this is sort of like with the function when we had a var in the outer scope and then we had a function with the same variable name shadowed inside the function scope. This is a similar situation, except, you know, now there's a gray area. What do we think is going to happen in the temporal's dead zone? So in this scope, before b is declared, what do we think this will be? What will be the value of b when it has a shadowed declaration outside in the outer scope? So lock in your answer, and you see we get that same error. So the JavaScript engine, when it runs through our code, it understands that there is a variable b inside of this scope. It does understand that. If it didn't understand it, then we would get the value 100 here, because it would see the variable b in the outer scope. But the JavaScript engine, it understands there is a b in this block scope, but it's not going to let us access it before it is defined when we're using let. So that is one caveat of using let and const, and sort of the reason I don't show it to newer students. But this actually makes you write better code. And when we do the example at the end, you'll really be able to see that. It'll be much clearer. So with block scope, you should never have these temporal dead zones. Even though they're possible, you should be declaring all your variables at the top of their scope. So for the block level scope, we are declaring it and defining it here at the top, and we would do the same in an outer scope if we were using function scope with var. So if this was a function again and we were using var, we should always be declaring at the top of the scope. And we're going to see a good example at the end that sort of brings all this together. One thing before we do the example, another reason I will use var with new students over using const and let is because of this. So if we wanted to make a variable x, and we'll set it to 100, we can access that. We can declare another variable x, and we're not getting any problems from the console or the JavaScript engine. We could even do this all at once, and there is no problem here. However, if we were to try the same thing with let, so we're going to make two let variables with the same name, we get an error. Identifier y has already been declared. And it should actually say identifier y has already been declared in this scope, because we've already seen that we could declare an identifier with the same name as long as that they're in different scopes. So with const, this same thing is going to be true. We're going to get identifier ZZ has already been declared. And so additionally with const, I'm going to refresh the page. So if we were going to make a const myVar, this is a declaration, and since it's an assignment, we said this is, we're defining a variable. With let and var, we saw that, we could just declare and not define. If we try this with const, we get an error. Missing initializer in const declaration. So we're not initializing the variable to a value, which is just to say that we're not assigning it a value while we're defining it. And the reason that this is a problem is because with const, I made this myVar2 set to 100, we cannot reassign this value. Type error, assignment to constant variable, that is what a const is. It's basically a let variable, except you cannot assign new values to it. And there are many situations where this comes in handy. One thing that you should know, so if we have const num equals 200, we can see num, we can work with it, we just can't give it a new value. That's what's going to throw an error. If we have a const that points to an object, we can't reassign this to a different object. We're going to get that assignment error. However, we still can work with, props on the object. That's just a made up property name. I'm just showing that we can add to this object. So we could do obj b equals obj a plus some string. So we can set new properties onto the object. We can reassign old properties to new values. The only thing that we can't do is actually assign the token, the actual name, obj, the const, to a different object or a different value at all. So it prevents us from, pointing to one object and then later pointing to another. So let's run through just a final example to sort of wrap this up and to show you why you might want to begin working with let and const. So this double check function takes an array of my items and it double checks just to make sure that we have everything we need before we leave the house. So we have our wallet, coat, car keys, socks, shoes, shirt, pants, and of course, directions. So we could call this like this. And it tells us we're missing 5 items. And the way it does that is it loops over the items that we passed in. And in the loop, it creates this next item variable. Now keep in mind that this is not how you should write your code. So it creates this next item variable, and then it checks if the required items array includes that item. So if it was coat, if I is equal to 0, next item is coat. It checks if required items includes coat. It does at index 1. And so then it sets this IDX to the index of coat in the required items array, which we just said was 1. And then it splices out coat from required items. If you've never seen splice before, it's a method of an array that mutates the array, and it can be used to cut items out of an array. So in this case, we start at index 1 and we cut one item out, and so the remaining array is just wallet, car keys, socks, shoes, shirt, pants, directions. And splice has other uses. You usually don't want to use splice, but so let's just continue on. So at the end here, we get the count of required items, because whatever the count is, that's how many items are missing, because the only items that will be left in this array are the ones that were not spliced out. So the ones that were not included inside of double check. To just double check that our function actually does what we think it does, so we can see we're missing 0 items when we actually pasted all the items into our array. So what is the problem with this? So like 5 or 6 years ago, you would actually give someone points for actually declaring all their variables. There were a lot of people that were not doing that. You would just see stuff like this all over the place. And they'd just be clobbering any variables outside of the function with the same name. But the trouble is that this code is extremely deceptive. Because it looks like, here we are declaring and defining this I variable to 0. In reality, we are not. If we had another I variable up here, or if we thought we had another I variable up here, We actually don't. So if we console log I equals I, if we run this, we see I equals 4. So these two i's are actually the same variable when we are using var. Var has a function scope, and so we create this I variable, and then here, I guess the JavaScript engine here is, trying to be helpful. It doesn't throw the error when we redeclare a variable, but in fact it makes the code very confusing, because if this was a large piece of code and you didn't realize this was happening, your variable is getting clobbered. In actuality, this code, should be like this. I should be declared up here. Same with next item. It looks like each iteration of this array would be creating a variable called next item, but it's not. There's only one big function scope here, and it's just overwriting the next item variable, which is fine. Like, we don't care in this case, because we're just setting a value to next item. We're using it one time or 2 times, and then on the next iteration we want to overwrite it anyway. So this seems like it's fine. If you're using asynchronous code, this becomes a problem, but that is sort of more advanced, so we're just going to stick to this for now. This really doesn't cause a problem here, but it is a problem, because it looks like we are declaring and defining a variable inside of this loop. But now if we come down here and we say like I found, and we'll just log out next item, this is very sort of difficult to interpret code. I mean, it's tough to know what the value of next item would be. We could figure it out because we have all the values of this array, and we could sort of go through the loop and figure out what this is going to be. But in a larger code base, with a lot of variables being passed around, it's tough to know what next item is going to be. And in fact, you shouldn't even really be able to see next item out of there. Right? It's shirt. We shouldn't really be able to see next item, because it's basically a relic of this loop. Like, next item doesn't really have any business outside of this loop. The whole reason we created it is, just for the purposes of what we're doing in the confines of these braces. And so that's why a lot of people, you would see them write something like declaring a variable inside of a loop, and it might not necessarily be because they're an idiot or something, because I'm not saying it's idiotic, but someone else that looked at this, they wouldn't realize that maybe in fact next item is being declared up here. So there's sort of no point to doing that. And if you had a huge function, it could actually cause problems, because people end up using the same variables. It's something that you saw a lot more in the past. Again, message, this isn't going to cause many problems. There's really no need for the message variable. We could just return that. However, just for the sake of this this video, you might as well put vars at the top. That is where they're declared. So now that I've shown you this, I'm going to you're going to erase all this, because you're not even going to write code like this anyway. We're going to look at let and const. So with let and const, we can create our I variable here, and it doesn't just look neater. It actually it does what it shows it does. It creates a variable I here, and this variable is only scoped to our for loop. So let me just change these to var real quick so they're defined, just so that I can show you if we try to get I out here. So we're declaring I here, defining it there. Let's run this. We're trying to access it out here, and we get a reference error. And that's because now we are actually, we're just creating variables for our loop. So with next item, we could use let, and I see a lot of people, they do use let in cases like this. I personally don't. I would use const because I'm only assigning this a value once. I'm never reassigning it, so I should just use const. It's just much clearer, but in any case, let, it's fine. So again, if we console log down here, I found next item with an exclamation mark, and then we run this, we should get the error, next item is not defined, because it's not, because we defined next item here. It's only scoped to these braces, and so we cannot see it out here. This goes a little bit further with let and const. And as I said, I'm not going to get into asynchronous programming. However, it is very important to note that on each iteration, a new next item variable is created. And later, when you learn about closures, which is kind of like another layer to scope, which is just way past the scope of this video, but it's very important that we are actually, if we loop through here 10 times, we're creating actual 10 variables with let. Okay, so that is another little thing that makes let better than var, because this scope allows us to, create all these different instances, basically, of a variable inside of our loops. Down here again, I would use const, but you could use let. And the reason I use const is because we define this and we never redefine it. Message could be const as well. Required items would be const. And so now this code is going to run the same. It does the same thing. And so at first you might say, okay, I'm telling you that this is sort of a better way to program, but if it does the same thing, what does it matter? And the reason it matters is when you work inside of large programs, when there's tons of variables, tons of different paradigms and scope, bunch of different programmers especially, you run into a lot of problems where somebody comes in, it might even be you, and you end up clobbering your own variables, or just accessing them somewhere where it looks like they should be defined when in actuality they're not. And when we use let and const, we're never going to put out code that does something like this. So say we tried to say forgot item, next item before our message. We're never going to put out code like this trying to access a variable that was defined inside of a loop, because JavaScript's not going to let us. It's going to throw an error, and so that will never even go into production. And so say we wanted to access next item outside of a loop, we can't just, with var, we just do it. Despite the fact that it's very hard to know what next item would be. If you wanted to do something like that, you would have to be very explicit, So we're being extremely explicit about what our code does. No one can look at this and say that next item is only scoped to this loop, because it's very explicit that it's scoped to the entire function. Or if there were other braces, it might be scoped to another little scope, but since the next brace is the function, it's essentially scoped to the whole function. So it's very clear that every time this loops and we assign to next item, we're no longer creating 8 different variables, because we're not creating a variable every time we loop around. We're just overwriting the same variable. But unlike with var, it's very explicit here, and so this code will work. And it just sort of makes you think about how you're declaring your variables, what you're doing with them. With const and let, programmers end up usually writing easier to read code, and it really makes you think about how you are declaring and defining your variables. You're not just making them on the fly, or if you are, you're not making mistakes